Big thanks to Into the AM for helping support my channel. Use my coupon code RISTER or any of my affiliate links for an additional 10% off of any order. Once again, big thanks to Into the AM for helping me bring this content to all of you. Over the past few months, I've been making a YouTube Shorts series compiling the worst matchup of every single character in Smash. And today, very similar to what I did for my Best Player of Every Character series, I'm going to be compiling every single one of those shorts together into one long-form video, both for my long-form only audiences to see it for the first time, and for my viewers who watch everything to see every episode crammed together into one video. Now, to be frank, this series put me through the ringer. Matchups are a very subjective topic, and you'll never be able to make every single person happy no matter what you say. But throughout everything, I tried to use the average of top player opinions to come to my conclusions. Nothing I say in these episodes is my own opinion, but the opinions of the top players, whose matchup charts I was consulting. That didn't stop me from receiving more hate for some of these episodes than I've ever received for anything I've ever made. Mostly from Twitter, mind you. But wow, it was really hard to deal with some days. And to be honest, I couldn't be happier that this series is finally over, because I really started to hate everything about it near the end. Either way, I've already gotten to work on my next short series, the best move of every character in Smash. And so, it's time we get into wrapping this one up for good. Without further ado, enjoy the worst matchup of every character in Smash. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 1, Mario. Here we go again. As a general rule of thumb, Mario tends to lose to characters with big swords who can outrange his stubby hitboxes. But there's also some other characters who don't fit that bill but still beat Mario. For this series, I will always consult top player matchup charts as my primary source. And on Kurama's most recent matchup chart, Sonic is listed at the very bottom, right next to Aegis, as Mario's worst. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 2, Donkey Kong. For Donkey Kong, I'm going off of Chunky Kong's matchup chart, and combining it with general opinion, I'm going to say that Donkey Kong's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch. Basically, Game & Watch just destroys nearly every heavy. Expect to hear Game & Watch come up a lot in this series. But we're not done here. After my first episode, I've decided to give shoutouts to other matchups that should be recognized as really terrible. These shoutouts are going to Sora, Diddy Kong, Pokemon Trainer, Steve, Pichu, Pikachu, and Mega Man. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 3, Link. For this episode, I've consulted the lists of Kion, the best Link in the world, as well as Flash Blaziken, and I even looked at Zamba's matchup chart, because he used to main Link before picking up R.O.B, if you weren't aware. And from these sources, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Link's worst matchup is Pyramithra, aka Aegis, who is able to rush Link down to prevent projectile usage, as well as Foresight being an excellent tool to prevent Nair spam. Shoutouts today are going to be weird, as all three lists that I consulted disagreed on what other matchups were among Link's worst. Kion's other terrible matchup was listed as Palutena, Flash Blaziken put down Pikachu, and Zamba had Marth, Lucina, and Min Min. So take from that what you will. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 4, Samus and Dark Samus. Finally, an easy episode for once. Samus's worst matchup is certifiably Olimar. One of the primary reasons for this is that Pikmin Toss, which Olimar's neutral centers around, beats out Charge Shot and gets rid of it upon colliding, which just destroys Samus's neutral. And as a general rule of thumb, any character who can easily get rid of Charge Shot, preferably with their own projectile, tends to beat Samus. For this episode, I looked at Siski's matchup chart, which lists Min Min on the same tier as Olimar, as well as Icy Mist's matchup chart, which has Duck Hunt and Falco in the same tier as Olimar. Yeah, Samus has some weird losing matchups for a high/top tier. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 5, Yoshi. Yoshi's worst matchup is Samus, who funnily enough we were just talking about in yesterday's episode. Generally speaking, Yoshi tends to struggle a lot against disjoints and swords. For this episode, I consulted the matchup charts of Suarez and Pharaoh. And while Pharaoh had specifically listed Samus as Yoshi's worst in her own tier, Suarez had Yoshi alongside plenty of other characters, namely Shulk, Roy, Palutena, Aegis, Chrom, Cloud, and Lucina. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 6, Kirby. This one was a little bit harder, but I've decided that Kirby's worst matchup is Sonic. Again though, just like yesterday with Yoshi, Kirby tends to struggle a bit with disjoints and swords. The two matchup charts I consulted for today's video was Jaw's matchup chart, which lists Ike and Shulk alongside Sonic, as well as Galehue's matchup chart, which has Sonic alongside Ike, Steve, R.O.B, Samus, and Snake. The only two overlapping characters between these two charts in the -2 section were Ike and Sonic. And between those two characters, I'm gonna go with Sonic being Kirby's worst. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 7, Fox. Light's matchup chart has Luigi, Mr. Game & Watch, and Pikachu all together in the -2 tier. And while I debated for a while which one to list as Fox's worst, I saw that Light once tweeted out that he lost to Esam, and he called it Fox's worst matchup. Only to then fight Meister in loser's bracket, which he called Fox's second worst matchup. I don't know how seriously you guys want to take this tweet, but since I have literally no other sources, it's all I really have to go on. So I'm gonna say that Pikachu is Fox's worst matchup, followed by Game & Watch, and then Luigi. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 8, Pikachu. Thankfully, we've got another easy episode today. Pikachu's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch, bar none. Shiny Mark has actually listed it as Pikachu's only losing matchup. This is mostly because Game & Watch is really good at pressuring shields, which Pikachu doesn't like, and because Bucket invalidates T-Jolt, which today is one of Pikachu's most important tools just in general. It's also worth noting that other Pikachus, like Esam for example, thinks that Pikachu loses to Ness, but Shiny Mark highly disagrees with this, and is actually undefeated versus Ness offline, including against Gact. So I'm inclined to trust Shiny Mark on this one. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 9, Luigi. Luigi's worst matchup is Sephiroth. Basically, Luigi struggles a lot with characters that can keep him at bay, like Belmont's whip or Min Min's arms. But Sephiroth's main advantage is that he can edgeguard Luigi really well, which is one of Luigi's greatest shortcomings. For this episode, I consulted Luigi's matchup chart, which has the Belmonts alongside Sephiroth in -2, Kiyarash's matchup chart, which had Min Min alongside Sephiroth, and lastly, Guy's matchup chart, which had Sephiroth as Luigi's sole -3 matchup. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 10, Ness. Ness's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch. If I had a nickel for every time I said that a character doesn't like disjoints or swords, but also just loses to Sonic or Game & Watch, I'm about to have a lot of nickels by the end of this series. Mr. Game & Watch just puts Ness in disadvantage and never lets up. Ness doesn't have a strong disjoint to challenge Mr. Game & Watch's aerials. And he also gets juggled for days. Not to mention most of his specials are invalidated by Bucket, including his recovery, which is never a good move to have invalidated. For this video, I consulted Sen's matchup chart, which also has Min Min, Aegis, Cloud, Lucina, Marth, Shulk, Kazuya, and Steve in the -2 tier. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 11, Captain Falcon. I'm starting to realize that this series may have been a bad idea. I'm not sure I fully thought this through. Why? Because Captain Falcon's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch. Again. Basically, Game & Watch just shuts down all of Captain Falcon's shield pressure. And the moment that Falcon goes for a combo that isn't quite true, Game & Watch can just up B out of it. For this episode, I consulted Fatality's matchup chart, which has Game & Watch as the sole character in the -2 tier. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 12, Jigglypuff. Guys, it's not Game & Watch this time. Instead, Jigglypuff's worst matchup is Sonic. Okay, so that's not much better, but it's something. Base Mage has actually listed Sonic as Jigglypuff's only -2 matchup. Mostly because having no ground game or speed against Sonic is brutal. And in case you were curious, the tier right above this one consists of Zero Suit Samus and Yoshi. Interestingly enough, Senra, the best Jigglypuff in Japan, actually thinks that both of those matchups are even. And this brings up something that I want to mention. People have asked me before why I'm not consulting matchup charts made by top players over in Japan. The answer is really simple. A lot of times, Japanese matchup charts are wildly different than ones over here in North America or even in Europe. I'm not going to say that they're wrong, I'm just saying that if I used those opinions, I would get flamed for days. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 13, Peach and Daisy. So get this, Peach's worst matchup is actually between either Mr. Game & Watch or Sonic. Why do I even try? I consulted 2 matchup charts for today's video, one of which being Mewdace's, which has Mr. Game & Watch and Sonic as the only characters in the -2 tier. I also consulted Ling's matchup chart, which has Sonic alongside Sephiroth and Luigi. So here's the deal, since Ling didn't include Game & Watch in the -2 tier, and since Mewdace has a better record against the top Game & Watches compared to the top Sonics, I'm just gonna go ahead and say that Peach's worst matchup is Sonic. Mostly because Peach has a really hard time hitting Sonic, as well as her never being able to pull out a turnip as long as Sonic stays at mid-range. And honestly, when it's between Mr. Game & Watch and Sonic, does it even really matter who I pick? Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 14, Bowser. So a few episodes ago, I mentioned how Japanese matchup charts are very different from NA and European matchup charts, which makes me lean towards using NA matchup charts for my primarily NA audience. But I should have been a little bit more careful in clarifying that I'm only doing that when the clear-cut best representative isn't from Japan. That's not the case for Bowser, as Hedo, the best Bowser in Japan, is also the best Bowser in the world pretty definitively. And according to Hedo, Bowser's worst matchup is Kazuya Mishima. Hedo also has Steve, Young Link, Wario, PT, Mega Man, Sora, and Ken in the -2 tier. But Leon, the best Bowser in North America, has a very different matchup chart. Leon thinks Kazuya is even, and that Bowser's worst matchup is Pikachu, listed alongside Greninja, Peach, and Wario. And this example is just a mild one of how much NA and Japanese matchup charts can differ. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 15, Ice Climbers. So here's a weird episode. Ice Climbers' worst matchup is Simon and Richter Belmont. Yeah, I know. I found it weird too. But basically, Ice Climbers loses to Disjoints and Swords harder than maybe any other character. And because of things like Cross and Axe, Belmont can actually zone out Ices better than some other characters like Cloud, Sephiroth, or Min Min. I consulted Big D's matchup chart for this episode, which admittedly is a little bit old. Since I was pretty unsatisfied with using a matchup chart from 2019, I went looking to see if I couldn't find a newer one. And what I found is that basically every Icy's matchup chart ever had Belmont at least tied for the worst matchup, if not far and away in their own tier, even on Japanese matchup charts. But the common consensus is that Icies struggle against characters like Cloud, Sephiroth, Min Min, Shulk, etc. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 16, Sheik. So get this, for the first time I was actually able to ask a top player what their worst matchup is. WebJP released this matchup chart as a part of their campaign for Watch the Throne, which had Steve, Pac-Man, and Olimar in the -2 tier. I actually asked WebJP which of these matchups they considered to be Sheik's worst, and I was told that Web goes between either Steve or Pac-Man for being Sheik's worst. It just depends on the day. And here's where Void's matchup chart comes in, as Void specifically listed Steve and Fox as Sheik's worst matchups, and Pac-Man was only listed as a -1. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that Sheik's worst matchup is Steve. Oh, and by the way, I did also consult Mr. R's matchup chart, but it didn't really help much, as it had Steve and Pac-Man in the -1 tier, and instead had Ice Climbers and the Rats as the -2s. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 17, Zelda. This one is also gonna be a weird episode. Zelda's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. For this episode, I consulted 3 different matchup charts. The first was Ven's, which has ZSS in the -2 tier alongside Joker, Peach, and Daisy. I also consulted Alo's matchup chart, which had ZSS at the very bottom of the -2 tier alongside Sonic, Aegis, Fox, Steve, and Greninja. And lastly, I consulted Zefty's matchup chart, which had ZSS alongside Fox, Wolf, Cloud, and Joker. In these matchup charts, the most recurring characters were ZSS, Joker, and Fox. And of the 3 charts that I consulted, Zero Suit Samus is the only character that showed up in the -2 tier of all 3 of them. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that Zelda's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 18, Dr. Mario. Dr. Mario's worst matchup is Shulk. This episode is a little bit difficult, not only because there's not a lot of top Doc mains, but because even among that limited number, not a lot of them have published matchup charts. But basically, Dr. Mario suffers a lot against disjoints and swords, due to his inability to get in effectively because he's super slow and doesn't have a big disjoint. So if the opponent can effectively space out Dr. Mario, they tend to beat him. For this episode, I consulted Bacon's matchup chart, which had Shulk and Rosalina as the only -2 matchups. And I technically consulted Sumosuto's matchup chart, because even though you can't find it anymore, apparently Sumosuto had Shulk as the only -3 matchup for Dr. Mario. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that Dr. Mario's worst matchup is Shulk. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 19, Pichu. This episode is another peculiar one. Pichu's worst matchup is Samus, and technically Dark Samus as well. It seems that a lot of people think that Mr. Game & Watch should be Pichu's worst matchup, basically for the same reasons that Mr. Game & Watch beats Pikachu. But when I consulted Netoru's matchup chart, it actually had Samus and Dark Samus as Pichu's worst, joined by Mr. Game & Watch, Pac-Man, and Yoshi in the -2 tier. I also consulted Drybee's matchup chart, who's a top Pichu player in Germany. Drybee specifically mentioned Samus as Pichu's worst matchup, but she's joined in the -2 tier by Shulk, Olimar, and Snake. So yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and say that Pichu's worst matchup is Samus and Dark Samus. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 20, Falco. Well, we had a good run, everyone. After a nice streak of episodes with no mention of him, the 2D menace is back to haunt us, because Falco's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch. Mostly because Falco can't shield pressure Game & Watch at all, and gets destroyed in disadvantage. This comes courtesy of Tilde, who has Mr. Game & Watch in the -2 tier alongside Sephiroth, the only 2 characters in that tier. And it's safe to say that this is a fairly common opinion. At least over here in NA, because this is one of those episodes where the Japanese matchup chart is pretty different. Masa, for example, thinks that Mr. Game & Watch is actually even, and that Falco's worst matchup is either between Kazuya or Ice Climbers. But again, since my audience is primarily NA, they're expecting the NA mindset and opinions. So I'm still gonna say that Falco's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 21, Marth. This is probably the most difficult episode of this series so far. The only 2 high-level matchup charts for Marth that exist are Rizeyasu's and Krieg's. However, Rizeyasu's matchup chart stated that Marth doesn't lose any matchups. Another case of Japan's matchup charts being unique. Krieg's matchup chart has Bowser and Greninja as the only -1, yes, -1, matchups. And when asked by a reply which one was harder, Krieg responded that it was Greninja. That choice seems to be a fairly acceptable consensus, so I'm just gonna go ahead and say that Marth's worst matchup is Greninja. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 22, Lucina. So Lucina and Marth actually have a pretty big overlap in their losing matchups. As different as they are, what makes a matchup winning or losing is something that Marth and Lucina have in common. Certain matchups like Diddy, Greninja, and Joker are seen as bad by both player bases. But that's actually not going to be Lucina's worst matchup. Instead, that honor is going to go to Sonic. Basically, Lucina can't hit Sonic due to how slippery he is, and also has a hard time taking stocks. This is courtesy of Leon, the French Lucina, not the American Bowser, who has Sheik, Diddy Kong, Greninja, Inkling, and Joker in the -2 tier. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 23, Young Link. Young Link is not particularly fond of disjoints or swords, but for once actually has a disjointed sword character as their worst matchup. That's because Young Link's worst matchup is Shulk. For this episode, I consulted 2 matchup charts. The first was Toast, which had Shulk listed alongside Aegis and Cloud. The second matchup chart belonged to Skittles, who had Shulk listed alongside Joker, Pikachu, and Wolf. Since Shulk is the only character that both charts had in common, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Young Link's worst matchup is Shulk. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 24, Ganondorf. Ganondorf's worst matchup is Min Min. As the worst character in the game, Ganondorf's worst matchup could theoretically be a lot of characters. At the very least, most of the game's top 5 could probably qualify as his worst matchup. But this take specifically is coming from Major, who has maybe the only high-level matchup chart for Ganondorf in existence, which lists Min Min as Ganon's worst alongside Snake and Mr. Game & Watch. It seems like Min Min is the most commonly accepted answer for Ganondorf's worst matchup, in comparison with the other two characters. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that Ganondorf's worst matchup is Min Min. And as for why, I mean, Ganondorf Min Min is just as bad of a matchup as it sounds on paper. I don't think I have to elaborate too much. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash Part 25, Mewtwo. Mewtwo's worst matchup is Fox. It's a little bit odd, I wasn't expecting it to be Fox. But for this episode, I consulted the matchup charts of both Anvil and Remrin, two of the best Mewtwo's in the world. Remrin had Fox as Mewtwo's worst matchup alongside Falco. And it is common consensus that pretty much every Spacey really does beat Mewtwo pretty hard. However, Anvil's matchup chart had Fox alongside Zero Suit Samus as Mewtwo's worst matchup. But because both matchup charts had Fox in common, and because Remrin DM'd me to tell me it was 100% Fox, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Mewtwo's worst matchup is Fox. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash Part 26, Roy. Roy's worst matchup is Pikachu. Basically, Roy is infamous for losing to 3 characters: Kazuya, Pichu, and Pikachu. For me, it was really just a question of which one do I pick. And once again, it came down to matchup charts having certain characters in common. Cola has both Pichu and Pikachu as Roy's worst matchup, sharing the tier together. Flo, the French Roy, has Kazuya alongside the Rats as Roy's worst matchup. And lastly, Goblin's most recent matchup chart has only Pikachu as Roy's worst matchup. And as Pikachu is the only character in common between all 3 of these charts, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Roy's worst matchup is Pikachu. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash Part 27, Chrom. So in all honesty, just like Marth and Lucina, Chrom and Roy are pretty similar in which matchups they lose. I could have just lumped the two of them together and no one would have batted an eye. But also, weirdly enough, just like my Marth and Lucina videos, Chrom and Roy don't actually have the same worst matchup. That's because Chrom's worst matchup is Joker. For this episode, I consulted 3 matchup charts. The first was Lancelot, which had Joker as Chrom's worst matchup alongside Sheik. I also consulted Mr. R's matchup chart, which has Joker alongside Pikachu as Chrom's worst. And lastly, I consulted Goblin's matchup chart, which has Joker all by himself as Chrom's worst matchup. And again, since Joker is the only character in common between all 3 charts, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Chrom's worst matchup is Joker. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 28, Mr. Game & Watch. I literally played Roblox with Meister on stream a few days ago and forgot to ask what Game & Watch's worst matchup is. Monty has listed Game & Watch's worst matchup as either Diddy Kong, Shulk, or Ike. Meister has it as either ZSS, Sonic, Rosalina, or Shulk. And Mia's matchup chart has either ZSS, Diddy Kong, Sonic, Wolf, Rosalina, Hero, or Aegis as Game & Watch's worst matchup. Which means that for perhaps the first time, there is not a single character in common between all 3 charts, right? Well, no, because Monty's matchup chart is severely outdated. I know this because I DM'd Monty to ask about it, and I was told that these days, Monty thinks that Mr. Game & Watch's worst matchup is Sonic. This means that we have a common consensus between all 3 matchup charts. And as such, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Mr. Game & Watch's worst matchup is Sonic. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 29, Meta Knight. We're finally on to the Brawl characters, and thankfully we've got an easy one to start us off. Meta Knight's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. For this episode, I consulted 2 matchup charts. The first was Bonks, which has ZSS in her own tier as far and away Meta Knight's worst matchup. The other is Shows, which has the -1s and the -2s all lumped together in one tier, and isn't ordered as far as I'm aware, but ZSS is here along with a lot of other characters. The reasoning for ZSS being Meta Knight's worst is that she's incredibly hard for Meta Knight to hit because of how fast and agile she is. She's also extremely hard to juggle thanks to Flip Kick, and she can space out Meta Knight very well using Zair. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that Meta Knight's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 30, Pit and Dark Pit. This episode's a tad complicated. There are only 3 matchup charts I could find that I'd consider to be relatively high level. And one of them is from Shiny Mark, who doesn't main Pit. That chart has Sheik and ZSS in the -1 tier. Another matchup chart is from Pit and Wii Fit co-main Silver, which has ZSS alongside Greninja. But there's also Tet, a high-level Japanese Pit main, who doesn't have ZSS in contention for Pit's worst, and instead has a ton of characters that notably includes Greninja, meaning that I'm stuck either having to pick Greninja or ZSS as Pit's worst. That being said, it seems as though ZSS is the more common consensus among NA audiences, and since that's who I'm making videos for, I'm gonna go with Pit and Dark Pit's worst matchup being Zero Suit Samus. The reasoning for why is basically the exact same as yesterday's episode. ZSS is hard to hit, hard to combo, and can outspace Pit with Zair. Eerily similar, isn't it? Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 31, Zero Suit Samus. We've been talking about ZSS for 2 episodes straight now. 3 if you include the Game & Watch episode. But who is ZSS's worst matchup? Well, that honor is going to go to Pyramithra, also known as Aegis. For this episode, I consulted Mars' matchup chart, which has a ton of characters in the -2 tier, including Aegis. I also consulted the charts of 3 other top ZSS reps, including Doorstop, Naito Sharp, and Shu. And among these charts, it's worth noting that Fox, Wolf, Diddy, Cloud, and Shulk are all considered to be pretty bad, but Aegis was the most common choice to have as the worst or near worst matchup. As for why? Well, Aegis shuts down ZSS's game plan of being evasive and slippery by being fast and combo heavy, not to mention that ZSS dies very early to Pyra. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 32, Wario. Apparently, Wario's worst matchup is Olimar. So I know what you're thinking. And let me be clear, when I started making this episode, I thought it was going to be Sonic 2, but the numbers just don't add up. I had to consult 6 different matchup charts for today's video, and I literally could not get a common consensus between them. But that was mostly because of Huto, the Japanese Wario, who had Aegis as Wario's only -2 matchup. Removing that outlier, the other 5 matchup charts belong to Jordan, Matador, Loaf, Whoopi, and Gluttony respectively. And the only character in common between all of them is Olimar. And in case you're wondering, Sonic was only listed as one of Wario's worst in 2 of the 5 charts, not including Gluttony's, which had Cloud, Olimar, Sora, Steve, Byleth, Joker, and Mr. Game & Watch as Wario's worst. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 33, Snake. Snake's worst matchup is Mega Man. Apollo Kage thinks that Snake's worst matchup is Min Min, but it seems as though AK is alone in this line of thinking. And Inkling, Game & Watch, and Mega Man are all listed as -1s. Every other Snake matchup chart I consulted either had Min Min in even or slight winning. Those other charts include Alan Disses, which says that Snake loses no matchups and therefore wasn't really that much help to me. Grapes, which has Inkling and Mega Man as Snake's worst. And Tomberries, which has Mega Man and Mii Gunner as Snake's worst. Again, I'm gonna go with the most common denominator and say that Snake's worst matchup is Mega Man. The reasoning is that any character who can safely get rid of grenades from a distance tends to do really well against Snake. In this case, Mega Man's pellets destroys grenades, and those pellets are a very fast, very spammable option. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 34, Ike. Ike's worst matchup is Roy. Basically, the debate for being Ike's worst matchup is mostly between Joker or Roy. The main supporter of the Joker argument is Raven King, who has Joker as Ike's sole -2 matchup. The main supporter of the Roy argument is Psychod, who has Roy as Ike's sole -3 matchup. It's also worth noting that I consulted the matchup charts of both Mega as well as Johnny, but both of them listed both Roy and Joker among Ike's worst. So here's what I'll do. It seems as though Roy is the more common consensus more recently, and so I'm gonna say that Ike's worst matchup is Roy. As far as I understand, the reasoning behind it is that Roy is just so oppressive and so fast that Ike sort of gets invalidated, because Roy can just spam buttons and hold forward, especially with Rising Nair, and Ike can't really do anything about it. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 35, Pokemon Trainer. Pokemon Trainer's worst matchup is Samus. Yeah, so I think a lot of people might disagree with me on this one. And they're gonna say that it should be Young Link. And for what it's worth, Young Link is probably the second worst. But it appears that, over time, more and more top PT mains are gravitating towards Samus rather than Yink being the worst. DD's chart has Sonic and Samus as the worst. Atelier's chart has Samus and Min Min. Doorstop's has Yink and Samus. And the only chart I consulted that didn't have Samus as the worst was Quid's, but I'm willing to accept that as an outlier, and say that Pokemon Trainer's worst matchup is Samus. The reasoning, as far as I understand, is that disadvantage in this matchup is really terrible. Not to mention Ivysaur just gets completely outzoned, and can't use Razor Leaf, which may be the best part about PT's neutral. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 36, Diddy Kong. Diddy Kong's worst matchup is Duck Hunt. Bet you didn't think Duck Hunt would win one of these episodes, did ya? I know what people are already thinking, and yes, Pac-Man is also extremely hard. Just like yesterday's episode where I said Young Link was the runner-up for PT's worst, Pac-Man is definitely the runner-up for Diddy's worst. For this episode, I consulted Tweak's chart, which has Fox, Pac-Man, and Duck Hunt in the -2 tier, as well as Ryuo's, which has Pac-Man and Duck Hunt alongside Young Link in the -2 tier. However, the real difference maker here was Zenodo, who has Pac-Man in even, and instead has Duck Hunt, Villager, Isabelle, and Olimar as Diddy's worst. As for the reasoning, basically any character that can prevent Diddy Kong from pulling banana, most commonly with projectiles, tends to beat him. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 37, Lucas. Lucas's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. So this episode is a treat, because this is one of the few episodes where I was actually able to talk to a top rep about this very subject. That top rep was Regalo, who had Zero Suit Samus in the don't bother tier of their matchup chart alongside Min Min, Olimar, and Young Link. This opinion is supported by Nighthawks, who has ZSS in the -2 tier alongside a bunch of other characters, as well as Japanese Lucas main Rinkaruru. Regalo's chart was recent, so I was able to reply and ask specifically which one was Lucas's worst and, more importantly, why. I was told that ZSS was far and away Lucas's worst. ZSS can outzone Lucas with Nair and Zair, is good at staying above Lucas where he can't effectively challenge her, and Lucas's combos are inconsistent against her. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 38, Sonic. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. Okay, I'm just kidding. Sonic's worst matchup is Fox. I actually consulted two of Sonic's matchup charts, both the normal one and the more recent one, which is unconventional and more like a difficulty chart. Both lists include Fox at the very bottom. I also consulted Pelly's chart, which includes Fox, and notably has a lot more of the campier characters in losing. Between Fox and Pikachu, I decided to go with Fox, mostly just based on Sonic's historic struggles against that character. The reasoning as to why is that any character who can keep up with Sonic, think Fox, Mythra, ZSS, or Roy, tends to do pretty well in the matchup. Also, any character that can out-camp Sonic also does pretty well. Think Pac-Man, Pikachu, Mii Gunner, Samus, or Young Link. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 39, King Dedede. This episode is a little bit difficult. If you're asking a Japanese player like Zaki or Meadow, then King Dedede's worst matchup is Diddy Kong. Pelly and Key both think that it's Sora far and away. And then there were charts from Addy, Hispanic at the Disco, and Kilogram Hours that had a lot of characters in the bottom tier altogether and no clear consensus on which one was the worst. So I'm gonna make a bit of a judgment call on this one. I'm gonna say that King Dedede's worst matchup is Sora. I think this is seen as somewhat of a common consensus, and at this point I have to resort to that because of how different all these matchup charts are. The reasoning is that King Dedede is combo food for Sora's Touch of Deaths. As Pelly said, Sora literally wobbles King Dedede. Also, Sora can pretty much negate Gordo, but a lot of characters can also do that. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 40, Olimar. Olimar's worst matchup is Cloud. This episode was pretty easy, because for once, every single chart that I consulted agreed. Those charts include DeBuzz's matchup chart, Myron's matchup chart, MFA's matchup chart, and Candle's matchup chart, all of which either include Cloud as one of Olimar's worst, or directly state that Cloud is Olimar's worst far and away. Other common choices include R.O.B and the Shotos. DeBuzz actually went in depth as to why Cloud is so bad for Olimar. Cloud throws out a lot of safe aerials that deal with Pikmin really easily. Olimar struggles to hit Cloud, can't take good trades with Cloud, and gets outclassed in mobility, range, and kill power. And lastly, Olimar can't really edgeguard Cloud good enough for it to matter. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 41, Lucario. Lucario's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch. Feels like it's been a while since I've said that. This episode was easy to decide, but hard to find a VOD for, because this matchup is so bad that Armadillo doesn't even go Lucario against Game & Watch. But yeah, I consulted Armadillo's matchup chart for this episode, which has Game & Watch in his own tier as far and away Lucario's worst matchup. And for good measure, I consulted Gidcheepy's matchup chart, which has Mr. Game & Watch and Lucas by themselves as Lucario's worst matchups. I tried to look for solid reasoning as to why, but for the most part, Lucario just kind of gets tear-gapped. With the exception of Bucket being particularly good in the matchup because it can absorb Aura Sphere, people are basically just saying that everything Game & Watch has just nullifies Lucario. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 42, R.O.B. Everyone knows that this episode is either between Bayonetta, Mr. Game & Watch, or Aegis. In fact, every single North American matchup chart that I consulted, from Zomba, Epic Gabriel, and Anathema, all had those three characters as R.O.B.'s three worst matchups. But which one of those three do I pick? Well, common consensus points to Game & Watch, and the competitive scene backs that up, with all of these R.O.B. players having far better records over Bayonetta and Aegis players than they do Game & Watch players. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that R.O.B.'s worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch. As for why, the reasoning is actually the same for all three characters. They combo R.O.B. really hard, and R.O.B. is pretty big, so he tends to be especially vulnerable to those combos. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 43, Toon Link. Toon Link's worst matchup is Pyramithra, aka Aegis. This is coming directly from Jojo DeHobo, who I actually asked what Toon Link's worst matchup was, and Jojo responded that it was Aegis, followed closely by Shulk. Jojo's matchup chart also had ZSS and Mega Man in the -2 tier. This opinion is supported by both Vivid and Spritzy, both of whom include Aegis in the -2 tier alongside Shulk and Cloud. The reasoning for all of this is that Tink loses to big swords. Toon Link's stubby hitboxes can't really contest these characters. And while Toon Link's projectiles can help a little bit, it's not nearly enough. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 44, Wolf. This episode is hard, because Wolf mains are torn between Wolf's worst matchup being either R.O.B. or Sonic. Both Jackal and More Salsa think that it's R.O.B., and both of their charts have R.O.B. all alone at the very bottom. Danny and Keen both think that it's Sonic, with Keen's chart having Sonic all alone as Wolf's definitive worst. And Ouch's matchup chart seems to be unhelpful, because Ouch thinks that Wolf loses no matchups. However, this chart is actually more than meets the eye. That's because this chart is fully ordered. And even though R.O.B. and Sonic are at the very bottom of the even tier, technically, Sonic is below R.O.B., which means that Ouch thinks Sonic is Wolf's worst matchup with R.O.B. as a close second. That means that the Sonic group outnumbers the R.O.B. group 3-2. So I'm gonna say that Wolf's worst matchup is Sonic. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 45, Villager. So with about 83 characters and 1 or 2 bonus episodes, I'm just gonna go ahead and consider this to be the halfway point of this series. With that said, Villager's worst matchup is Hero. Panda Bear has Hero at the very bottom of their matchup chart. And the same goes for Bobby Wasabi, who has Hero alongside Mii Swordfighter and Min Min as Villager's worst. And lastly, Javi on Earth, while notably thinking that Aegis is worse, still has Hero as a bottom 3 matchup. As for the reasoning, I actually managed to find a reply to Bobby Wasabi's chart, asking why Hero was so bad for Villager. Bobby Wasabi responded with a single word, bounce. So, yeah. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 46, Mega Man. Another difficult episode because none of the reps agree. Peebnut thinks that Mega Man's only losing matchup is Palutena. And MPG's most recent matchup chart has Mr. Game & Watch, Fox, and Pikachu as Mega Man's worst matchups. Out of these specific opinions, I'm gonna go with Pikachu, as it seems to be the most commonly accepted of these choices within the wider community, who I should also note thinks that Min Min is very bad for Mega Man as well. But I'm deciding to go with Pikachu over Min Min. The reasoning is because Pikachu can be very hard for Mega Man to hit, as well as being both good at camping and good at oppressive combos. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 47, Wii Fit Trainer. Wii Fit Trainer's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch. For this episode, I consulted Varun's matchup chart, which sadly isn't available anymore because Varun's Twitter is gone. But the chart had Mr. Game & Watch, Falco, and Pikachu as Wii Fit Trainer's worst matchups. Interestingly enough, the Wii Fit Trainer Discord actually released a chart of their own, combining the opinions of 3 top Wii Fit players, John Numbers, Evie, and Nick District. They released both an optimistic chart and a pessimistic chart, and the only commonality between the two charts' worst matchups is Mr. Game & Watch. As far as the reasoning goes, Mr. Game & Watch is really good at nullifying side B, hitting the ball back with basically any move. Mr. Game & Watch can also challenge Wii Fit's planking by using Chef, which is a big pain. And also, absorbing Neutral B with Bucket will kill at 0. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 48, Rosalina and Luma. I literally played Roblox on stream with Dabuz, Meister, and Spargo, and I forgot to ask Dabuz what Rosalina's worst matchup is. So most people would agree that Rosalina's worst matchup is either Pyramithra, aka Aegis, or the Belmonts. Kind of weird options to pick from, I know. Dabuz's matchup chart has those two alongside Roy as Rosalina's worst. But between the two main choices, I'm gonna go with Aegis, because I think it's a slightly more common consensus between the two of them among the wider community. The reasoning as to why is because Rosalina really hates matchups where she can't win neutral, and Mithra is really good at playing neutral. Also, both Mithra and Pyra are really good at dealing with Luma. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 49, Little Mac. Little Mac's worst matchup is Pac-Man. My 3 main sources for this episode are Peanut, Quaz, and Tarakatori. Peanut's matchup chart isn't available anymore, but it had Pac-Man as Little Mac's sole -3 matchup. Quaz's matchup chart has Pac-Man alongside both Peach and Pikachu as Little Mac's worst matchup. And Tarakatori had Pac-Man at the very bottom of a fully ordered matchup chart. The reasoning, as far as I understand, is that Pac-Man can camp Little Mac harder than any other character by utilizing bonus fruits and especially Hydrant in order to make Little Mac really suffer. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 50, Greninja. This episode is weird because again, no one can agree. Tarek has Mega Man and Wario as Greninja's worst, and once told me that it was Wario, bar none. But every other Greninja has told me that Tarek is wrong and is just scarred by gluttony. Ice Knight has Sonic and Snake and told me that Snake was Greninja's worst, far and away. But Ice Knight is the only Greninja to have Snake in contention for Greninja's worst. Rarcure's chart has Sonic and Pichu out of nowhere, and Anarchy has Fox, Sonic, Bayo, and Mr. Game & Watch as the -2s. So I'm just gonna have to compromise. 3 out of 4 charts had Sonic in at least contention for Greninja's worst. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that Greninja's worst matchup is Sonic. Mostly because it's very hard to hit Sonic with Greninja's inconsistent combos. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 51, Mii Brawler. I'm actually recording this the day before it comes out because of Easter, so hello from the past. This episode is easy. Mii Brawler's worst matchup is Shulk. I say it's easy because Fire the Pyro got together a ton of Mii Brawler mains, including Slashy, Apple Reviewer, Mac, Yeast, Esam, Kid, Achilles, and Superberry, and averaged all of their charts together in order to create one perfect Mii Brawler matchup chart. Let me tell you, that made my job a lot easier. With those results, Mii Brawler's worst matchup is Shulk, far and away, who had a score of -1.4. Coming in second place and also in a tier all by himself was Cloud, who had a score of -0.9. The reasoning as to why seems to stem from Mii Brawler's difficulties approaching characters with big disjoints or swords. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 52, Mii Swordfighter. So this episode is super easy because Mii Swordfighter doesn't lose any matchups, given that they're the best character in the game. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. Okay, kidding. Happy April Fools. Haha. Mii Swordfighter's worst matchup is Greninja. This comes directly from Aaron, who I named the best Mii Swordfighter in the world, and who I was able to directly ask about this subject. I was told that the answer I was looking for was Greninja, even if Aaron wasn't entirely sure she agreed. For what it's worth, Scrubbed Out also agreed that it was either Greninja or Zero Suit Samus. And it seems as though Greninja is a fairly common consensus, so I'm gonna go with that as my final answer. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 53, Mii Gunner. Mii Gunner's worst matchup is Min Min. For this episode, I consulted Capitancito's matchup chart, which has Min Min alongside like 20 different characters in a tier named Don't Even Play This. I also consulted Lammers44's matchup chart, which goes out of its way to specify Min Min as Mii Gunner's worst matchup. And this does seem like a fairly common consensus among the wider community. As for the reasoning, I was actually able to find a reply from Lammers44 talking about this matchup. Basically, Min Min's arms go through nearly all of Mii Gunner's projectiles, so it's incredibly hard for the Mii Gunner to get in or do any damage. Min Min does exactly what Mii Gunner does, just better. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 54, Palutena. So this episode is either between Diddy Kong or Pikachu. On Team Diddy Kong, we have Jagaimo, who has Diddy at the very bottom of their matchup chart, as well as possibly Chag, who has both Diddy Kong and Pikachu in the bottom tier of their chart. But I don't know if this chart is supposed to be ordered or not. On Team Pikachu, we have Jen, who lists Pikachu explicitly as Palutena's worst, as well as Louis Money, kind of. Because Louis Money has Sonic and Aegis as Palu's worst, but has Pikachu as a bottom 5 matchup and Diddy Kong in even. But because Chag had both Diddy Kong and Pikachu in the same tier, I'm gonna count that as a point for both teams. And so, Team Pikachu outnumbers Team Diddy. The reasoning is partly because Palutena relies a lot on rising aerials, and any small character that doesn't get hit by those is gonna be a bit of a pain. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 55, Pac-Man. So this episode is between two species, either Fox or Wolf. But after looking over the charts, I think I'm going to give Pac-Man's worst matchup to Wolf. This comes from Kiwi, Madzai, and JDV, all of whom have Wolf in the lowest tier of their charts. I don't know if any of these charts are supposed to be ordered or not, but Wolf seems to be a somewhat common consensus among the wider player base. The only Pac-Men who disagree are Sinji, who thinks it's Fox, and Rocky, who thinks it's Cloud. The reasoning behind Wolf being the worst is that both species have the tools to really rush down Pac-Man and get in his space. Wolf specifically has some really good tools for disrupting Hydrant, like back air, and Shine is a really good tool to have against Pac-Man. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 56, Robin. Robin's worst matchup is Olimar. I think this is a fairly common consensus among the wider Robin player base, but I did consult two matchup charts for this. The first one was Angels, which has Olimar alongside Aegis, Min Min, Pikachu, Mr. Game & Watch, and Sheik. The second chart was from Morocco Yo, the Venezuelan Robin, who had Olimar alongside Young Link, Squirtle specifically, Pichu, Mithra specifically, Greninja, and Sheik. But again, Olimar seems to be the common consensus. The reasoning is that pretty much all of Robin's projectiles get nullified by just a single Pikmin toss. The same reasons why Olimar beats Samus so hard, basically. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 57, Shulk. Sorry about this, Ramses, but Shulk's worst matchup is Snake. This is probably the most common consensus out of any episode I've done so far. Elijah Min has Snake in the -2 tier alongside R.O.B, and Nico has Snake alongside R.O.B, Diddy, Roy, and Joker. But the other two charts I consulted, both Fizment and Jared is King 1, both had Snake in his own tier as far and away Shulk's worst matchup. The reasoning for all this stems around Grenade, and how useful it is as a tool that disrupts almost everything that Shulk wants to accomplish. For what it's worth, some Shulks have been thinking a bit more optimistically about the matchup recently, but for now, this is still far and away the common consensus among Shulk mains. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 58, Bowser Jr. Bowser Jr.'s worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. This comes directly from Yoda Cage, who has ZSS in her own tier of difficulty, but Ketchup thinks that ZSS is only a -1, meaning I had to consult a third chart for a tiebreaker. Shiny, who is ranked number 4 on the first version of Shoe Stats if you weren't aware, has a matchup chart that includes ZSS in the -2 tier, and I believe this choice is a somewhat common consensus among the wider player base. So I'm going with ZSS. The reasoning for why is that Zaire dominates neutral, she's fast enough to disrupt any setup Junior tries to go for, and she's really good at juggling while simultaneously being really good at not getting juggled. Follow and stay tuned for more parts.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 59, Duck Hunt. Duck Hunt's worst matchup is Mega Man. This comes directly from MboZ and Sekai Doggo, who both had Mega Man in the -2 tier of their matchup charts. MboZ had Mega Man alongside Joker as Duck Hunt's worst, and Sekai Doggo had Cloud alongside Mega Man in their chart. Also, big Duck Hunt fan 7000 once told me that Steve was Duck Hunt's worst matchup, but as far as I can tell, that seems to be an outlier, so I'm gonna go with Mega Man. As for the reasoning, Sekai Doggo explained it a bit, by saying that Mega Man doesn't have to change his neutral in order to win our neutral, which made the matchup hard. I'm not entirely sure what that exactly means, but I'm assuming it's related to Mega Man's projectile game outclassing Duck Hunt's. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 60, Ryu. So this episode is really weird. Let me start by saying that I'm going with Steve being Ryu's worst matchup. My main source on this is Vendetta, who has Steve in his own tier of difficulty on their matchup chart, and interestingly enough also has Ice Climbers in their own tier of difficulty right under Steve. But Ashimo also has a matchup chart, one that was made a week ago, which has Greninja and Ridley as Ryu's worst matchups. Yeah, and if you think that's peculiar, Ashimo's last matchup chart had King Dedede as Ryu's second worst matchup. You know, in case you guys still don't believe me that Japanese matchup charts can be peculiar sometimes. However, on Ashimo's most recent matchup chart, Steve was listed in the -1s. So honestly, I'm just gonna go with Steve. Mostly because blocks really disrupt Ryu's fireball camping. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 61, Ken. Ken's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch. My 3 sources for this were Vendetta, Takara, and Smirk. Vendetta has Mr. Game & Watch at the very bottom of an ordered -2 tier, the only tier on Vendetta's chart to be ordered. Takara actually thinks that Rosalina is Ken's worst, but has Mr. Game & Watch in the -1s. And lastly, Smirk has Mr. Game & Watch in the -2 tier, alongside Marth, Lucina, and Samus. Since Mr. Game & Watch is the biggest common denominator between all 3 of these charts, that's what I'm going with. Game & Watch tends to do really well against all the Shotos, since he can bucket their projectiles, get out of disadvantage with up B, has a really good advantage state, and both edge guards and ledge traps every Shoto really well. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 62, Cloud. Cloud's worst matchup is Aegis. This is coming directly from Spargo, who made a video about Cloud's matchup chart. And at timestamp 3414 in that video, Spargo directly says that Aegis is Cloud's worst matchup. For what it's worth, Anthony Isn't Cool thinks that Sheik is actually Cloud's worst matchup, but didn't have any problems with me saying it was Aegis for the sake of this video. The reasoning, according to Spargo, is that Mythra is really hard to deal with, because Mythra's frame data and speed are so good that Cloud struggles to keep up with her or hit her. Funnily enough, that's basically the same reasoning that Anthony Isn't Cool gave me for Sheik, but I'm still gonna go with Aegis. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 63, Corrin. This episode is hard because obviously my 2 sources are Neo and Shattuck, but they don't actually agree on what Corrin's worst matchup is. Neo's matchup chart says that Corrin's worst matchup is Sheik, while Shattuck's matchup chart says that Corrin's worst matchup is either Fox or Snake. And then, Neo and Shattuck collaborated together to make another matchup chart, which has Sheik and Snake as Corrin's worst, which again, ties Snake and Sheik up at 2-2. So I had no choice but to consult a third opinion. Lai, the Corrin who beat Spargo at SmashCon, has Corrin's worst matchups as Sheik and Sephiroth. And with that tiebreaker, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Corrin's worst matchup is Sheik. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 64,
Bayonetta. Bayonetta's worst matchup is Sonic. This episode is pretty easy, since this is a fairly common consensus. Bayonettas like Lima, Geist, and Deathspade all have Sonic at the bottom of their matchup charts. And while other characters, especially Fox or Snake, can also be included, most would agree that Bayonetta's worst matchup is definitely Sonic. The reasoning is that Sonic can use Spin Dash all he wants and Bayonetta can't really do anything about it. She doesn't get a lot off of grabs, and her out of shield options aren't good enough to deal with Spin Dash. So Sonic can get away with mashing, essentially. Follow and stay tuned for more parts.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 65, Inkling. Inkling's worst matchup is Shulk. My sources for this are Shirayuki, who has Shulk alongside Yoshi as Inkling's worst matchups, as well as Space, who has Shulk alongside a few other characters that also includes Yoshi. So why am I picking Shulk over Yoshi? Because Shulk appears to be the common consensus among the wider Inkling player base. The reasoning as to why boils down to two key issues. Shulk outranges the heck out of Inkling, and Shield Monado art is a massive pain for Inkling to deal with, because it messes up a lot of her confirms like up throw up air. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 66, Ridley. I'm a little sick today, forgive me. Ridley's worst matchup is R.O.B. So for this episode, I have to give a massive thanks to Kiyoki, who went through the trouble of compiling nearly every notable Ridley matchup chart, all into one place for me to use. It surely made my job a lot easier. Notable names here include Mezcal, Smub, Rydra, Kaden, and more. And the -2 matchups were Samus, Young Link, R.O.B, Palutena, and Sephiroth. So why did I pick R.O.B? Because when I personally asked Mezcal, who I consider to be the best Ridley in the world, I was told that R.O.B was the answer I was looking for. The reasoning is because any character with a good counter, good horizontal presence, good whiff punishing, and a good close range game tends to beat Ridley. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 67, Simon and Richter Belmont. The Belmont's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. In the matchup charts of T3 Dom, Squid Plumber, and Karu, Zero Suit Samus is listed at the very bottom, with common other choices in the -2 tier being Pikachu and Joker. But I'm going with Zero Suit Samus as it appears to be a more common consensus. The reasoning is that ZSS is extremely fast and agile, so she can maneuver around Belmont's projectiles really well, and is just hard to hit in general. Zaire is extremely good in the matchup, and so is her good juggling game. But the main problem in this matchup for the Belmonts is Flip Kick. Using Flip Kick, ZSS can basically skip Belmont's ledge trapping, which is their biggest strength as a character, that ZSS can just ignore entirely. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 68, King K. Rool. King K. Rool's worst matchup is Meta Knight. Now, to be fair, I actually don't have a lot of charts for this, because there aren't really that many top King K. Rools out there. But Lukewarm, previously known as Kirby Kid, had Meta Knight in the -2 tier alongside a ton of other characters. And although it is admittedly an older chart from 2021, Ben Gold did have Meta Knight in the -2 tier of their matchup chart. But Meta Knight seems to be a somewhat common consensus between the wider K. Rool player base. The reasoning is really simple. Meta Knight's ladder combos are really good on K. Rool. Add on to the fact that Meta Knight is small and somewhat hard to hit, and that's a pretty good combination to fight K. Rool right there. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 69, Isabelle. Isabelle's worst matchup is Pikachu. This comes directly from Mr. Zircon, who has Pikachu as Isabelle's only -2 matchup. An opinion shared by B. Rice, who has Pikachu in the -2 tier of their matchup chart as well. The reasoning for this, as far as I understand, is that Pikachu can outcamp Isabelle, outbox Isabelle, and T-Jolt is a really good tool for getting rid of the Lloyd trap. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 70, Incineroar. Incineroar's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. This comes directly from SkyJ, who has ZSS at the very bottom of their matchup chart alongside Min Min and Sonic. SkyJ once told me that Incineroar's worst matchup was either between ZSS or Min Min. And then, SkyJ made a post going over Incineroar's worst matchups, and listed as number 1 as the worst matchup for Incineroar was Zero Suit Samus. So that's why I went with ZSS.
The reasoning boils down to the fact that ZSS is just way faster than Incineroar, and can run circles around him while she juggles him to death. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 71, Piranha Plant. This episode will 100% take the award for the weirdest answer in the entire series, because Piranha Plant's worst matchup is Isabelle. Yeah, I'm not kidding. I averaged the charts of several Piranha Plants, namely Gruward, Brood, Amasara, and Diz. I would show you the -2 sections of these charts, but they wouldn't fit onto the screen. The averaged results show that the 3 worst matchups for Plant are Isabelle, Sephiroth, and Villager. And of those 3, I'm going with Isabelle, because Gruward specifically said that it was Plant's worst. The reasoning is that Pocket is insanely good against Patui. Like, nullify your entire game plan type of good. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 72, Joker. Joker's worst matchup is Sonic. This comes directly from MKLeo, who has Sonic all by himself at the very bottom of their matchup chart. I would show it to you, but I couldn't download the chart because it's locked behind Leo's Metafy. But other Jokers would support this opinion, namely Omega, who has Sonic alongside Pikachu in the -2 tier, as well as Goryoka, who has Sonic alongside Shulk and Inkling. The reasoning is that Sonic camps the heck out of Joker, and can out-prioritize his moves with Spin Dash. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 73, Hero. We've finally arrived at the episode that I've been looking forward to the least. But I'm gonna say that Hero's worst matchup is R.O.B. This is coming from only the best hero main, Spice, who has R.O.B all by himself in the -2 tier. Oh, and also this other hero main named Beast Mode Paul, I think, who has R.O.B alongside Suit Samus, but mostly from Spice. Okay, haha, very funny, Rister. But real talk, I was actually so worried about this video that I DM'd BMP to just ask what I should say, and received a response for once, where BMP told me that it was R.O.B because, and I quote directly, R.O.B edgeguards him for free, can outbox him, can snipe menu with laser/gyro from afar to stop it in neutral, and stops Hero from fishing for zoom off stage. So don't get mad at me, this is directly from BMP. What more could you possibly want from me? Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 74, Banjo and Kazooie. Banjo's worst matchup is Olimar. So funnily enough, the wider Banjo player base seems split on this issue. Half of them thinks that it's Olimar, and the other half thinks that it's Falco. But when I consulted Torigudi's matchup chart, it had Olimar at the very bottom in his own tier of difficulty. And that's all I needed to hear. For what it's worth, Juan P would also agree with this take, and took the time to tell me why this matchup is so bad. Apparently, it's because Pikmin Toss nullifies both of Banjo's projectiles, Banjo can't easily get Pikmin off of himself, and he gets camped out really hard. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 75, Terry. Terry's worst matchup is Pyramithra, aka Aegis. This is coming directly from Darkstalker, who has Aegis and Shulk at the very bottom of this matchup chart, and considers the two interchangeable for Terry's worst. But Aegis appears to be the more common consensus among the wider Terry player base, so I'm going with that. The reasoning is that Terry can sometimes struggle with disjoints and swords, and Aegis does a really good job at rushing down Terry, and keeping him in disadvantage the entire game. He's also fairly edgeguardable in this matchup, either from Mithra up B, or Pyra down air at ledge. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 76, Byleth. If you didn't know any better, you may assume that Byleth's worst matchup is Min Min, but it isn't. In fact, while character player bases always try to recommend options to me for videos, the Byleth episode is the first time that a player base has asked me to steer away from a certain character, to pick anyone but Min Min. So Byleth's worst matchup is Sonic, and I've got multiple sources. Justin Byleth, for instance, once told me that this was Byleth's worst matchup. Additionally, Rizeyasu has Sonic at the very bottom of this matchup chart, and Reno also has a similar result. And of course, so does MKLeo. The reasoning is fairly simple. Byleth can't really challenge Sonic camping, because Spin Dash goes through everything. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 77, Min Min.
Okay, fine, I concede. Min Min's worst matchup is Sheik. This is coming directly from Justice, who made a very recent matchup chart that specifically has Sheik as Min Min's worst matchup. Zurzel also has Sheik at the bottom of this chart, alongside Greninja and Pikachu. And although this one is older, from 2021, the chart made by Dabuz, Pink Fresh, and Minmane also has Sheik as Min Min's worst matchup. The reasoning, according to Justice, is that all of Sheik's aerials and needles clank with Min Min's arms. And by the time Sheik finishes her long combo, Min Min is off stage, setting up for a relatively free edgeguard. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, part 78, Steve. So a lot like the Mii Brawler episode, the Steve community really helped me out on this one. Rockman gathered around 20 Steve mains, including Akola, Onin, DD, Syrup, Sor, Susu, and many more, and with their help, made 2 Steve matchup charts. One chart was based off a popular vote between all of them. That chart had Zero Suit Samus and Sonic as Steve's only -1 matchups. The other chart that they made was a mathematical average of all their separate charts mixed together. This chart was fully ordered and had Cloud and Sonic next to each other, with Cloud at -0.525 and Sonic at -0.65. And since Sonic is the lowest one on this chart and is the only character in common between both charts, I'm going with Steve as being Sonic's worst matchup. The reasoning is that Sonic doesn't have to worry about blocks or minecart, and can effectively out-camp Steve, and sometimes take the stock faster than Steve can. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, part 79, Sephiroth. Sephiroth's worst matchup is Diddy Kong. This is coming directly from Ned, who has Diddy Kong at the very bottom of this matchup chart as Sephiroth's sole -2 matchup. And for what it's worth, Tweak's matchup chart also has Diddy Kong in the -2 tier, alongside a bunch of other characters. The reasoning is mostly because Sephiroth really struggles against small characters, who Sephiroth can struggle to hit. And of those small characters, Diddy's banana can negate Sephiroth's range advantage by just throwing the banana. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, part 80, Pyramithra, aka Aegis. If you were to ask the Aegis player base, a lot of them will likely tell you that Min Min is Aegis's worst matchup. But I'm here to argue that Aegis's worst matchup is not Min Min, but is instead Diddy Kong. My 2 sources for this are Space and Chase. Space released a matchup chart very recently, and Chase released a tier list. But more importantly, this allowed me to ask both of them what they thought Aegis's worst matchup was. Space was very direct and told me straight up that it was Diddy Kong, and Chase said that it was either Diddy Kong or Pikachu. I'm gonna say that Aegis's worst matchup is Diddy Kong. The reasoning is somewhat similar to the Sephiroth episode. Aegis can struggle against tiny characters. And of the tiny characters, Banana makes Diddy Kong particularly annoying, because it gives Diddy one of the best out of shield options in the entire game, Z-Drop. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, part 81, Kazuya. Kazuya's worst matchup is Sonic. This is coming directly from Riddles, who released a matchup chart pretty recently that had Sonic at the very bottom in his own tier of difficulty, and also has Steve in his own tier of difficulty as well, but with Sonic being worse. This is a very common consensus among almost all Kazuya players. Nearly every notable Kazuya main you can think of has Sonic at the bottom of their matchup chart, if not specifically listed as Kazuya's worst. The reasoning is that Kazuya is too slow to contest Sonic just camping him. And again, Spin Dash's initial armor just breezes through all of Kazuya's options. Sonic doesn't really have to do anything special. His normal game plan is just really good at nullifying Kazuya. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, part 82, Sora. Sora's worst matchup is Fox. This is courtesy of Kameme, who has Diddy Kong and Fox in the -2 section of this matchup chart. Additionally, Deathspade has Fox in his own tier of difficulty on their matchup chart. And lastly, Rarcure once responded to one of my tweets to tell me specifically that Fox was Sora's worst matchup. The reasoning is that Fox is just too fast, and is really good at rushing down Sora. It doesn't help that Sora can sometimes struggle to combo Fox. This isn't going to be the final episode of this series, as I'm planning a few more episodes to tie up some loose ends. So it's not goodbye just yet. But for now, follow and stay tuned for more parts. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 83, Corrections. I've made a few mistakes here and there, so here are the corrections. Basically, I considered an episode to be wrong if and only if the majority of top reps both said that I was wrong and agreed to a better option. Number 1. I said Mario's worst matchup was Sonic, but Kurama told me it was Mr. Game & Watch. Number 2. I said Kirby's worst matchup was Sonic, but Galehue and Jaja told me it was Steve. Number 3. I said Palutena's was Pikachu, and was told nearly universally that it was Aegis. Number 4. I said Bowser Jr.'s was Zero Suit Samus, but TM7 Zap and Yoda Cage told me it was Palutena. And lastly, number 5. I said Ken's was Mr. Game & Watch, but Jazzo told me it was Ice Climbers. I've put these corrections into the Google Doc version of this list. I'll also be using these corrections in tomorrow's episode, the final one. Follow and stay tuned for the final part. The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 84, Random. Okay, Rister, what is this? Basically, this episode is an excuse for me to tally up the results from this series and tell you who won the most episodes. The reasoning being that if you went random, this character is most likely to be your worst matchup, and therefore is Random's worst matchup. Just to note, this is taking yesterday's corrections into account. The top 4 of this series is Sonic in first place with 11 characters, the only one to reach double digits, Mr. Game & Watch in second place with 9 characters, Aegis in third place with 7 characters, and lastly, Zero Suit Samus in fourth place with 5 characters. Everyone else past this point is tied with someone else, so I'm going with this being our top 4. This full list, by the way, with everyone's results, will be posted on my Twitter account. Follow and stay tuned for the next series. The best matchup of every character in Smash, parts 1 through 82, everyone is here. Every single character's best matchup in the game is Ganondorf, because Ganondorf sucks and is bad. Hope that clears some things up for you. Okay, but in all seriousness, my worst matchup series was originally supposed to be best and worst matchup. But when I tried making the first episode with that, I realized it was a really bad idea. Firstly, because, Ganondorf, and also that it would just take up way too much time for a short. I could barely fit everything I wanted into the episodes as it is. So I ended up cutting it down to just the bad matchups. Wow, look at that. We finished another series and in just one short. I'm so proud of us. Look at us go. Follow and stay tuned for the next series. So now that we finished up our most recent short series, and even a little mini joke series, what's next for us? Well, I've actually already decided on what my next series is going to be. I'm going to be doing the best move of every character in Smash. I picked this series for 2 reasons. 1, it's pretty chill, which I definitely need after last time. And 2, I'm planning to just use my opinions, not having to consult anyone else, which will also be nice after last time. In case you're wondering, I won't be looking at these moves in a vacuum, but rather saying that they're a character's best in context of their entire moveset and how integral it is to their game plan. Also, sometime this week I'll be uploading the worst matchup series altogether as a long-form video, so be on the lookout for that. In the meantime, watch some of my other long-form videos or the streams that I produce every single weekend. Follow and stay tuned for the next series. That's going to be it for today's video. Before I go, shout out to my patrons Seth Laster, Falco233, Logan S, Persipalm, Wawa, Mr. Sinister, Happy Feet, Oshiman, MistyBot, and my Tuesday patrons Iltis, Diamond Blaze, and Ben L. Additionally, shout out my YouTube members DTR Jr., Defective, Boston R, Gonis B, Kirby Fan, Nexus, Loco Soco, and my Tutor members Mike G, Wu-Tang Forever, and Stormtrooper. Also, shout out my gifted Tier 2 members, what are usernames, Lucky Jericho, Kuro Ruko, LWeWe74, and Enchanted IBE. Lastly, extra special thanks to my Tier 3 supporters, Fat Blizzard, who says dogs are better than cats, Avadoon, who says Mr. Rice is the Go to Smash content, and Iltis, who says Shattuck is top 3. If you want to support me using any of these methods, links are in the description down below. Don't forget to use my coupon code RISTER in order to get 10% off of any order from Into the AM. And lastly, I want to give one last sincere thanks to Let Me Fly for their continued support of my channel. Link to their Twitter page is also in the description. Don't miss tomorrow's upload, but until then, I've been Mr. Mice, and thank you all so very much for watching.